All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone, and it is a real pleasure to welcome Margaret Sheridan to give the talk today. Margaret's an associate professor in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience at UNC, where she directs a lab called the Circle Lab. She was trained at Berkeley, NYU, and Harvard, and moved from Harvard, where she was an assistant professor at the med school, to UNC in 2015, and she's been a wonderful addition to UNC's campus. Her research focuses on how different facets of childhood adversity affect different facets of neurodevelopment using both imaging techniques, which I'm sure she'll tell us more about, but also cognitive testing. I've known Margaret since maybe 2013 or 2014, and I met her in the context of developing non-verbal, sort of non-numerical cognitive testing protocols for Indonesia. These were to measure multiple aspects of executive function as well as emotional regulation. And Margaret just has this very clever setup of sort of challenges and then recording timing and, normal conditions and for baseline and stimulating conditions. And it was super interesting. And I have to say, I started out a little skeptical that these would work in Indonesia, and they were incredibly successful. I have these great memories of these 85-year-olds happily doing their tablet-based assessments. So it was just wonderful. And she's worked on these types of tools for implementation across many different survey-based projects. And I can see her imprint popping up at these talks where I have no idea it will show up. So that's been really sort of a wonderful facet to me of Margaret's work and a terrific intersection with the world of population. So today, Margaret is going to talk about deprivation and threat, testing conceptual models of adversity, exposure, and developmental outcomes. And I just put this in the chat, but during Q&A, please either type your name in the chat and we'll turn on your mic so you can ask your question yourself, or type a question into the Q&A box and I'll ask it if you'd like. Either way is totally fine. So Margaret, thank you so much for being here. We've been looking forward to this.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here today. And it's so lovely to be just in the presence of Elizabeth and to be part of this, being able to speak with you. In the course of my education, I did spend about 3 years in the School of Public Health. And in thinking through coming back to speak with you, and I was briefly affiliated with the Pop Center at Harvard, although most of my time was in the School of Public Health. And it's just exciting to begin to talk again with people who have a lens which is different than the one that I interact with on a day-to-day basis, and a lens I'd really like to see evidenced in my work better. And so I'm excited to hear your comments and have a conversation afterwards. So today I'm going to speak about the dimensional model of adversity in psychopathology. And my research with this model answers this fundamental question, which is, how is brain development linked with adversity? And how does this contribute to risk for psychopathology? That's really the central question that I'm trying to address with most of what I do. And I think one useful question to ask is, why would we care about that? So let's sort of begin there. The reason why I think it's useful to be thinking about different aspects of adversity, which I'll talk a lot about during the talk today, and why asking the question, how is adversity linked with brain development specifically as a pathway to psychopathology? The reason why I think that is important is because there are instances, and I think there could be more instances, where we target interventions better so that we're able to intervene with kids and adults in the area where they need help, given the experiences that they've had historically. And right now, interventions around adversity exposure tend to be pretty scattershot, sort of giving people a lot of different kinds of help based loosely on the sorts of experiences they've had. And one of the examples of this are there was sort of an explosion in mindfulness interventions in schools that happened a few years ago, and around specifically kids who were likely to be adversity exposed or who were sort of in low-income schools. And that was fantastic. I'm sure that was helpful for kids to get those kinds of experiences and exposures. But some of my work really points to the importance of different kinds of experiences leading to very specific cognitive difficulties that wouldn't necessarily be best addressed by a mindfulness intervention. And I really thought seeing that explosion, doing a better job of targeting these interventions might really help kids in a fundamental way. And also adults. And most recently, I've been involved in this reversibility network, which is a network really focused on increasing the degree to which adversity is measured well in intervention studies, and then also used as sort of an effect modifier. And then subsequently, the idea being that you could use that information to really target interventions. And right now, this reversible network is funded by the NIA, and it's really about aging, but it's got a real lifespan perspective, and we're kind of operating in like a midlife kind of place. And I think are hoping that we get to see that spread to both sides of things. So, so to begin with, I just want to sort of mention why the other piece of why I'm talking about different types of adversity. We know that adversity experienced during childhood is associated with long-term deficits in health and well-being. And this has been shown time and again, and it led to this sort of statement by Hertzman and Boyce that social environments and experiences get under the skin early in life in ways that affect the course of human development. But it's not just an association. There's also lots of evidence from randomized control trials, or enough evidence from randomized control trials to indicate that these associations are causal, that exposure to prolonged adversity in early life leads to changes in the brain, behavior, and physiology. And I've had the opportunity to do some of that work myself, examining the impact of early randomization out of an institution and into a foster care intervention. And we observe changes in the brain up to age 16 that are sort of not only in a sort of an initial effect on the brain that you can still observe at age 16, but also importantly in a shift in the developmental trajectory, even during adolescence. That sort of development is affected by these early experiences. So given this really robust evidence base that adversity matters, I think it's sort of no longer very useful in my own research to ask the question, does adversity matter? And instead I have focused the bulk of my research program on how adversity matters, how it is that it gets under the skin, what the pathways are. And I'd like you to think for a moment about, as we sort of begin this conversation, about these two different pretend children who I'm going to describe to you. One is Michael. Michael has a mom who's an invested caregiver. She's trying hard to help Michael live, develop and grow in the most useful way for him. But he also has a father who has problems with explosive rage. And when he is in fits of rage, he hits and sort of harms both Michael and his mother. So he's introduced to a really robust set of learning experiences around violence and the potential threat of violence on his life. But he's also exposed to somebody who's really sort of invested in his social and cognitive development and is trying to help him learn and grow as a child. And in contrast, there's Sarah. Sarah has a single mom who is an invested caregiver as well and really wants Sarah to do best, but they are very poor and they have to work multiple jobs. And so Sarah's mother just isn't able to be present for Sarah. And because she doesn't have a lot of resources, the kinds of caregivers who take her place are caregivers who also don't have a lot of skills and resources. They're young and they have multiple kids they're trying to take care of, and they don't have a lot of time to invest in Sarah's social and cognitive development. Sarah is protected from violence, but she sort of experiences a lack of inputs that would be appropriate for her developmentally to continue to help her grow. And currently in our conceptions of adversity, these two kinds of exposures are grouped together. They're both considered adversity exposures. And the most common way of conceptualizing adversity is through an accumulative risk model, where each of these kids would be exposed to one adversity conceptually. And the mechanism for that first I should say, like, the reason why that model exists, the cumulative risk model, is because it's a very excellent way of predicting who is going to be at most risk for negative outcomes, really across the board. If you want to talk about physical health or mental health or comorbidities or mortality, a great model to ask who is going to be most at risk is a cumulative risk model. And one of the ways in which this has been most commonly conceptualized is as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. So you sort of count up the number of adverse childhood experiences, and then you show that increased number of experiences is associated with increased risk. And there is a mechanism proposed for this model, and that is the stress mechanism. And the idea here is that this cumulative exposure, each of it adds a little bit of stress. And here people are talking actually about the physiological experience of stress in the body. And that cumulative stress leads to this sort of cumulative effect. And I think this very popular and important model is one way in which adversity comes to affect health and well-being later. But I think my fundamental argument is that it's not the only way. And my initial problems with this model were, I began my work actually studying the ACEs model and thinking about stress as the primary mechanism for adversity exposure. And where I felt it came up short is in thinking about childhood. And I really thought our entire theory is that these early experiences get under the skin and affect development because of the developmental plasticity of the child's brain and body. And that the stress is the only stress, the initial data on the stress mechanism from rodent models and the initial conceptualization of it is really as a sort of a decay model. So the idea of allostatic load would be that you are having a hard time accommodating the continued impact of events, of stressful events. And so your body is then unable to sort of maintain stasis. And that entire conceptualization is just very different from how I understand the brain to be developing. There's just an enormous amount of data that shows that the brain is experience expectant. It is a system which is designed for experience to come in and shape the way that it works for the future so that it's the most efficient brain for the future that it's going to experience. And so here I'm showing cortical thinning in a longitudinal study from 5 to 20 years of age, just demonstrating the sort of vast changes in neural structure that happen across that age range. And the places where they happen are differential. So you see a lot of change in the prefrontal cortex and other areas of association cortex like the parietal cortex and superior temporal cortex. And you see less changes in parts of the brain that are primary sensory or motor areas. And one of the reasons why you see this change is because of the proliferation of synapses early in life, followed by pruning during childhood. And this proliferation and pruning of synapses is one of the known ways in which experience gets into the brain. So if you're thinking of experience just like as exposure to vision or light, or sorry, visual stimuli or light, or exposure to different kinds of phonemes that you're going to need to speak later, one of the ways that we know that those early experiences which shape the way you see and hear and are able to produce language, one of the ways they get into your brain is through selective pruning away of synapses after an initial burst in the first year of life of synaptic proliferation. And subsequent to that initial sort of change, which is sort of a sensitive period change, there's a long period of developmental plasticity that does last all the way through adult life. But their initial period is really important for that and is really specifically experience expectant. So in terms of thinking about how this would then function with regards to adversity, it really became clear to me that it's very specific. The part of the brain is listening to specific kinds of input in order to function, to have sort of specific structure to meet the demands that it's expecting to have later on in life. And so conceptualizing all of adversity as a big group that would accumulate together doesn't really make any sense when you're thinking about the brain. The brain is modular. It has it's a networked together set of regions that underlie specific forms of function and will take specific kinds of input in. So in sensory areas, visual parts of the brain take in visual input and auditory parts of the brain take in auditory input. And I wanted to begin to think about how we could separate out the aspects of adversity into sort of kinds of inputs that the brain would be getting. And the initial approach that I took to that, and I think that I've been working on for the last few years, is this idea of thinking about deprivation and threat separately. And so those two kids that I described in the middle sort of fall into examples of kids who have two different kinds of experiences, two different dimensions of experience. On the one hand, you have exposure to threat, which would include things like physical and sexual abuse, domestic violence, and community violence. So all the way from sort of specific threats to the self through the observations of threats, like increased threats in the environment, and domestic violence and community violence. And that would be like specific learning experiences about threats that people would have as they were developing. And in contrast to that, there could be something, there could be a dimension like like deprivation, which would include things like institutionalization, where you just have a lack of inputs as a result of a lack of caregiver experiences early on in life. Similarly, neglect, with just sort of a lack of caregiver inputs, and even something like poverty, where even though you have an invested caregiver, that caregiver doesn't have the resources to manifest that investment as experiences, enriched experiences for you as a child. And we picked these two dimensions initially, not because we thought they were the only dimensions that had ever existed, but because these two dimensions are really well studied in child development. There was already a lot of information going into creating this theory about how these specific kinds of dimensions affected kids' development. So in the beginning of this, we developed some hypotheses about how we thought deprivation and threat might differentially impact child development. First of all, we thought that the different dimensions would affect brain and behavior differently, and importantly, that they'd be robust to controls for the other. So here we're really describing a statistical model. We're not trying to find kids who only have deprivation exposure or only have threat exposure. We're saying we understand that the world is complex and that people have various kinds of exposures. They're often co-occurring. What we want to know is if we take the degree to which you're experiencing deprivation and we control for the degree to which you're experiencing threat, will we see specific predictions for your behavioral and neural outcomes? We also wanted to show that this impact of adversity on the brain was a pathway to psychopathology. One of the important things about the cumulative risk approach is just this very robust prediction to health outcomes. And we also imagined that these would be predictions to health outcomes. And we wanted to sort of show that this was relevant actually to people's lives, not just sort of a neat trick of showing different forms of adversity impacting the brain. And then finally, I'm hoping I'll have some time today to talk a little bit about how we were investigating this conception that the dimensions are natural kinds, that we could, instead of imposing our own theory, we could sort of observe them arise from data-driven approaches. There's some limitations to this theory, many. First of all, 2 dimensions don't describe all of childhood adversity. There's a big push right now to study unpredictability and its impact on neural function and structure. This is unrelated to that whole push. And so we acknowledge that there are many other forms of adversity out there. We're just trying to describe these dimensions. And then I think importantly, I've already said this, but we're really thinking of proximal inputs and proximal outputs. So we think that it's not the intention of the caregiver or even the attachment relationship of the caregiver. It's actually the proximal experiences that the child's brain has that lead to that are sort of learning events or the lack of learning events that result in very proximal outcomes like changes in cognition or emotional reactivity that may ultimately in a probabilistic fashion become health and well-being outcomes. But initially we're really trying to identify what does the brain experience as a child, and then what very proximally is happening to its functioning during that course of development. So really specifically, we hypothesized that threat exposure, the way to conceptualize it was that they were early learning experiences enriched for violence, and thus they should enhance neural systems which support dealing with danger. So this very clear idea that you're gonna, the stimulus is gonna have a system which is used to processing it, and that system specifically will be shaped by the exposure to that stimulus. And some of our initial data came from some studies of rodents, appropriately enough, given all the work in adversity and rodent work. And they're from some studies of what happens if you, in attachment learning in infancy. And so if you take a dam and exposure to a typical healthy environment for her, when she raises her pup, she has sort of typical behaviors with her pups. And what you see in their pups is that very early on in infancy, if you expose them to a noxious stimulus in the context of their mother, they will form an attachment to that stimulus. And that's even true, early on, they'll just form an attachment to whatever noxious stimulus you show them, and no matter what. Later in infancy, they'll do that same attachment behavior if their mom is present. So they show this affiliative response to even very noxious stimuli if their mom is around. If you expose that mother to a set of circumstances which leads to her exhibiting what we would think of as abusive behaviors with her pups, so she's very rough in handling them, and she only spends about 30% of her time doing this. It's not constant, but she shows sort of rough, abusive behaviors with the pups that are not normative. What you see is that later infancy period, her pups acquire fear earlier. So they no longer, in the presence of their mom, have this attachment response, they acquire fear. And that same thing happens if you just expose the pups to a lot of shock stimuli early on in life, no matter what their parent is doing. So sort of the presence of exposure to violence early in life sort of shifts this fear learning to an earlier period and enhances the neural systems which underlie that. And that has outcomes in adolescence and adulthood, which are, the rodent vague equivalents of health and well-being outcomes in humans. So in thinking about how this might look in humans, we hypothesized that early experiences of violence, things like sexual and physical abuse, domestic violence, and community violence, would disrupt specifically the circuitry in the brain which underlies the fear response and is also in humans reliant on for a lot of emotion regulation and reactivity processes. So we thought it would disrupt ventral medial prefrontal cortex function and its control over limbic reactivity. And we thought this would result in symptoms of psychopathology later. We initially developed this theory in the context of a study called the Stress in Adolescence Study, a bunch of work that my colleague Kate McLaughlin and I were working on at that time. And so I'm going to tell you about some small studies which sort of demonstrate these associations that we expected to find. I'll begin with this one, which is in this first initial study, we had 51 adolescents. About 38% of them had reported experiences that would be classified as abuse, and about 21% of them had parents with less than a high school education. And we just did a very simple emotion reactivity and regulation task with them, where we put them into the scanner and we looked at their neural function while they were seeing a neutral or a negative image, and then we asked them to report on what that image was like. Oops. Yes, it disappears. I apologize for that. I'm going to tell you what that is. That's flashing up super brightly. It's like unconscious. I'm trying to unconsciously prime you. So that is a graph that shows that the kids with abuse exposure have higher amygdala reactivity to the negative relative to the neutral images, and the kids without abuse exposure have lower amygdala reactivity to those same stimuli. So just showing that you have this kind of increased reactivity in the part of the brain that we thought would be affected by abuse. And that actually is pretty similar to a lot of work that existed at this time, showing that kids with abuse reacted more to fearful faces. They reacted more to, they were able to identify negative affect earlier in faces, or especially aggressive affects. There's sort of a lot of data that's kind of consistent with this idea going into the development of the theory. What we had less of was evidence in early childhood at this point. And so to begin with, we did a pilot study in my lab when I arrived here. And we wanted to examine those same processes in early childhood and also using exactly the outcomes that we had predicted earlier. So we got, again, a pretty small group of kids, 64 of them, who were 4 to 7 years of age. So they're closer to the time period that you would want to be studying, given that data that I was showing you from the rodent studies. And we were also able to actually measure deprivation a little bit better and threat a little bit better. So for deprivation here, we gathered information about neglect from the child, from their own self-report. We gathered information about cognitive stimulation in the home from parent report, and we gathered information about parent education. For threat, we got information about violence exposure from the child's report, the parent report of interpartner violence, and then an abuse predilection questionnaire. We controlled all of our analyses here for age, gender, and IQ. And here we looked at deprivation controlling for threat and threat controlling for deprivation. They happen to be uncorrelated in the sample. I can also talk about that correlation in representative samples elsewhere if you want me to. So first of all, what we did was a fear learning task, which is much closer to the thing that people were studying in rodents. And so we have in fear learning tasks, you show people one stimulus and nothing bad happens, and you show them another stimulus and some percentage of the time a really loud negative sound happens, which makes them jump. And what we observe is whether or not their skin conductance comes before, like when they see that stimuli, which predicts the negative sound, do they get an increase in skin conductance response, meaning their body is sort of preparing physiologically for something bad to happen. And what we found are two things. First of all, we also measured skin conductance when this negative sound occurred. And what we found, first of all, is increased threat exposure was associated with just a blunted response to the sound. So your skin conductance following that negative sound was overall lower and blunted if you'd been exposed for threat to threat. And that was controlling for deprivation, age, gender, and IQ. We also interestingly found this very intriguing, very small n interaction, which is that kids who were in the high threat group and who were younger, so this is age in months on the x-axis, had greater differential skin conductance when to the stimuli which predicted the sound compared to the stimuli which never predicted a sound. So this is not when the sound is on, this is before the sound. You see their skin conductance increased at an earlier age. And in blue, the kids in this earlier age group who were not exposed to threat didn't show that differential response. Now, as you can see, this is sort of a few data points, and we obviously need to follow this up in a larger sample. which we are currently doing. But we were excited because this was very similar to the rodent findings and sort of exactly what we would have predicted given that earlier rodent data. We also obviously predicted differences in the brain. And so we were able, and this is all work done by Laura Macklin, who's a graduating grad student in my lab, sadly. And so we were also able to get data from the Duke Anxiety Preschool study where they had about 68 participants with usable MRI data where they had done we measured neural structure in their brains. They were between 4 and 11 years of age. So they're sort of like a wider age range, but they had good measures of deprivation and threat. So for parent report, we had neglect and parental involvement, kind of a sort of a cognitive scaffolding scale. But for threat, we had a pretty robust measure of domestic violence, abuse, or violent environment. So whether or not they just witnessed violence in their home or neighborhood between adults. And we had pretty high rates of violence exposure, slightly lower rates of threat of deprivation exposure. And so we were able to ask whether or not threat controlling for deprivation predicted neural structure in this sample. And in this sample, we were also able to control for cumulative risk or kind of just other bad stuff that was happening to them. So this control doesn't include threat or deprivation. It just includes other bad things, car accidents, being in the hospital, having a parent with a major illness, those sorts of things. We used FreeSurfer, which is a tool which automatically measures cortical structure and subcortical structure. And we looked at the volume of the amygdala, hippocampus, and striatum in the subcortex, and then the surface area and thickness in the whole brain. And what we saw is that threat controlling for deprivation and cumulative risk, anxiety, age, gender, and scanner predicted smaller volume in the amygdala and hippocampus. So here we're seeing decreased volume in the hippocampus and the amygdala associated for kids with threat compared to no threat. There was no other regions that were significant. If you look at structure in the brain, what you see is that threat is associated with a smaller surface area right along the whole medial prefrontal cortex, kind of as predicted, but also in the sample in the superior frontal cortex and also in the inferior frontal gyrus on the left-hand side. So you are seeing this really global effect of smaller surface area in the prefrontal cortex associated with threat, and that's controlling for deprivation. And also, interestingly, deprivation wasn't associated with cortical surface area at all. So across these studies, we concluded that threat is linked with increases in emotion reactivity, earlier fear learning, and associated with changes in the amygdala and medial prefrontal function and structure. So we sort of felt like we were honing in on, or we had sort of initial evidence for this part of our hypothesis from the DMAP predictions. We have also in other studies shown that harm or threat of harm in childhood is associated with decreased automatic and explicit emotion regulation. So there's sort of this a piece of what happens with emotion function that we're still spending more time working on, but we do have at least this initial evidence that emotion regulation might be also specifically affected by threat, and our conceptualization there would be that it sort of uses the same underlying neural circuitry, which is used for fear learning, which is why you kind of observe it in fear learning in rodents and also in humans, but that neural circuitry doesn't just do fear learning in humans. Obviously, we have a rich set of behaviors that we need to use our brain for, and so we can't just have it only be doing that. So let's talk about deprivation. This is a different set of experiences, and we have a different set of hypothesized outcomes. And a fundamentally related but different mechanism. So whereas threat conceptually is the presence of negative learning experience, here we're thinking of deprivation as a lack of species typical cognitive and social inputs. So this is sort of the brain is experience expectant. It's looking for specific kinds of inputs in early childhood. And if those inputs are absent, then it will develop atypically as a result. And specifically, we're thinking of the richness of linguistic input and social and cognitive stimulation sort of generally. And this is a figure from a paper that we wrote in 2017, sort of showing a mother helping to scaffold her child's cognitive and social development through play and interaction and reading. And the idea there is that you'd have this rich dendritic arbor that would be maintained and shaped appropriately. And in the lack of that, you might get a sort of underdeveloped, an increase in pruning and an underdeveloped dendritic arbor, which we would see as a decrease in cortical thickness. This is our initial sort of hypothesis. And the parts of the brain that we thought were experience expectant for these specific kinds of inputs were association cortex. So specifically the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex. Parts of the brain, and the reason why they're called association cortex is that these parts of the brain are places where information comes together. There are primary sensory areas whose job is to just do sensory stuff. There are primary motor areas whose job is to just do motor things. And then there are these association cortex, which are neither primary sensory or motor, where lots of information from motor and sensory areas comes together across modalities to do complex higher order cognition. And so in thinking about what part of your brain would be experience expectant for your parents' sort of cognitive and social stimulation, I really thought those would be the parts of the brain that would matter. So it's not a very specific area like just the inferior frontal gyrus, but it was generally lateral prefrontal cortex, superior and inferior parietal cortex, and potentially parts of association cortex in the temporal lobe. And specifically the kinds of inputs here would be things like neglect, but also observe scaffolded interactions, linguistic complexity, cognitive stimulation. And we thought that this would sort of disrupt pruning and prefrontal cortex dysfunction, and that would also lead to psychopathology ultimately. And why do we have this idea? It was because rodent models also showed that depriving rodents of sensory or humans of sensory input did change dendritic arbitization and cortical thickness in those primary sensory areas. So it was sort of like theory by analogy. If that's what what is experience expected in sensory cortex, if we can think of what the experience expected response would be in association cortex, it should be that same response for these kinds of inputs. And we knew from work that had already happened that institutionalization was associated with big changes in cortical structure and reduced volume in middle childhood. And also now have recently shown that in adolescence. So we had seen that, and then we had recently done some work showing that if you just measure cognitive scaffolding in the family, that is also associated with really selective deficits in executive function and language. So it has this sort of pretty specific pathway to these cognitive outcomes that are important for all forms of function, but which are very sort of non-emotional cognitive abilities. And again, in that same stress and adolescence study that I talked about initially with the graph that flashed off the screen, we also in that same study gave them a very simple working memory task, and we showed that here we only had parental education. We didn't have any other measure of deprivation, but we did show that parental education increasing parental education improved task performance, and it changed activation in the parietal and prefrontal cortex. And this is controlling for maltreatment in the same study with kids who have pretty frank maltreatment exposure and also age and gender. So this is showing that difference in parietal cortex as a function of parental education. And then here you can see the same thing in the middle frontal gyrus, in the anterior cingulate, but not in the inferior frontal gyrus. And these are the sort of regions of interest that we use in order to show that association there with parental education. So this is also kind of initial evidence for that idea that came out of that first study. In the wellness, in the early childhood study that I reported on with the fear learning, we also gave them a cognitive control task. It's a very simple task where you press on the same side of the screen when you see a pink ball, and you press on the opposite side of the screen if you see a yellow ball. So they're congruent and incongruent blocks. When you see the yellow ball, you have to withhold your response, and that's a little harder. So you have to inhibit your response to press on the same side and choose a different action. And that's considered a test of inhibitory control. So we gave them this test behaviorally, and this is one of the tests that I believe was given in the STAR study. We gave them this test to a bunch of kids, and then we showed that controlling for threat, age, gender, and IQ, deprivation predicted performance on that task. So this is, it made them faster and more accurate on the task. If you look at cortical thickness in the same study that I showed you earlier with those big changes in volume associated with threat, we found that deprivation but not threat predicted thickness in cortex, and that's controlling for cumulative risk, anxiety, age, gender, and scanner. Interestingly, we found that deprivation predicted thicker cortex in more recent work, I think that finding has come out more commonly, being associated with both adversity and specifically with deprivation. So I think that's going to be a more common finding, actually. So we didn't see thinner cortex, but we did see a very selective change in cortical thickness that was related to deprivation, but not threat. So here we're seeing that deprivation controlling for threat is linked with deficits in cognitive function, particularly executive function and language, and associated with differences in prefrontal and parietal gray matter thickness and function. I haven't actually shown you language yet, but I will in a minute. So I quickly want to just say, we didn't leave it there. So we have 2 grants that are going to follow up these samples and try and re-ask these questions in larger samples with more robust measurement. And the first one is this whale study, where we're about 1/3 of the way through the study. And we've managed to get a group of kids between 4 and 6 years of age. It's a pretty adversity exposed sample. About 58% of the sample have a primary caregiver who's unemployed. It's 62% non-white, and about between 61% have witnessed a violent experience between adults, and 71% have experienced a violent event involving an adult. So we're going to their homes and we're measuring cognitive social stimulation, executive function, and social status. We bring them into the lab and we do EEG and fear learning. And then we have an imaging session where we do inhibitory control, emotion regulation, and reward processing. So a lot of the same things I've just shown you now, sort of bigger and hopefully better. Also really fun, I had a student who worked with me, a postdoc who worked with me when I was at Children's Hospital in Boston, Carmel Sahaley, and he showed across a bunch of countries that you also get these differential predictions of deprivation and threat. This is just a figure from his 2021 paper showing sort of the impact of physical discipline on this side and emotional reactivity and emotional functioning. And then I'm realizing, sorry, the titles aren't there. And then counting books and books on this side being associated with cognitive function. So again, across a wide variety of settings. And I'm not going to talk today much about it, but I have a couple of other papers using these tablet tasks in a couple of different settings internationally, showing this sort of differential impact, often unintentionally. So people who are just studying exposure to violence, but just showing sort of a pretty a lack of effect on cognitive function and sort of a preservation of cognitive function, and sometimes a more specific effect on emotional outcomes. So I think we're sort of seeing this also across a lot of different country settings. So that was the kind of way to address this. We need bigger data. I've been doing these studies and kind of what are pretty good samples for imaging, but not great samples for the rest of the world. And I knew that because I'd hung out in a school of public health before. So we initially started to try to address that through our own data collection, and then also through identifying samples where we could test some of these hypotheses in existing data sets. And what the other benefit of looking into existing data sets is we could also address the second hypothesis, which is that the impact of adversity on the brain would be a pathway to psychopathology and not just a impact on the brain alone. And so what we were able to do is get 2 different studies in which we were able to test this full model. And this is work done with Adam Miller, who's a research assistant professor in the psych department, and he used to be my postdoc. So the Child Development Project is the project that was headed up by Ken Dodge. That's began in the 90s, I think the 90s, 80s. And we just reanalyzed that data looking at deprivation and threat. So it's about 585 kids. Between the ages of 5 and 6, they have a home observation where they looked at the scaffolded cognitive interactions and also scaffolded cognitive tools in the home. And they also measured threat, abuse, and family and harsh discipline, and observed hostility. At age 14, they have vocabulary, which is obviously a pretty rough measure of cognitive function, but it's the one which was available. And then at age 17, they have psychopathology as measured on a questionnaire, the CBCL. So we used an SEM model with bootstrap resampling. I'm going to show you the entire model. I will say the statistical part of this is not my expertise. This is stuff that Adam has done really, and I have worked with him on. But he's a careful statistician, and I can tell you the things I do know about the work that we've done together. But what we showed is that deprivation did impact externalizing psychopathology through verbal ability. So there was a significant indirect path to externalizing psychopathology. And there was a significant direct path from threat to both internalizing and externalizing psychopathology, two aspects of psychopathology. And that was robust to a control for socioeconomic status. So if we looked at socioeconomic status as a control of the outcome, we continue to see that indirect path. We then replicated this in the Fragile Families dataset, which is a more representative sample of families, and it's a publicly available data set. And we just show essentially the same thing. So we show that deprivation, here we're measuring it in years 1 through 3, impacted verbal abilities. Now we're measuring that in year 5, and then that led to increases in both internalizing and externalizing psychopathology in year 15. So that same indirect path. And again, a robust direct path of threat on those outcomes in the model. We're following up this set of analyses with another current data collection project. We're following up the kids who, I showed you some data from the Duke anxiety study with the brains. That was part of a much larger study where the original sample was a sample of 917 kids who were patients at primary care clinics in Durham. And it's a representative sample of those kids. So we're trying to follow up all of those children now. They're between the ages of 15 and 20 years. And that initial sample, as I described, had a pretty robust exposure to threat and some exposure to neglect, although we don't have a great measure of the rest of deprivation there. So we're hoping to get a better measure now. And we're gonna see where they are with their psychopathology, and also whether or not we can see some of these longitudinal predictions now in a sample with a richer measurement of mediators. And I'm not going to tell you too much about that. I can tell you lots more if you want to afterwards. So the final thing I want to talk about, and I just want to make sure I have time to do that with a couple.
Yeah, we should maybe end up with questions in 5 to 7 minutes. Would that work?
Totally. I just want to talk quickly about this idea of natural kinds. And here the question I had is if there was a data-driven approach to understand, to examine these associations, if we'd still see them. So in a typical cluster analysis, you see co-occurrence of exposures because of the thing which is driving those, the sort of structural inequalities which are driving them. So you see things that co-occur with poverty and things that co-occur with abuse sort of clustering together. What I wanted to do is try something a little different. So I took a network approach because it's a general solution to examining structure within a set of relationships. It doesn't care what data you use, and there are nice methods for describing clustering. And I wanted to take that network analysis and use it to examine associations within these sorts of exposures. But I also wanted to add in my hypothesized mediators to see if that would reorganize the network from the existing exposures, which you would expect to see, into sort of two clusters, which showed you the deprivation and threat theory. So that was my idea. And I worked with people at Odom, especially one scientist, Bill Shee, to develop a set of methods that would allow me to do that, because it was sort of a different way of approaching data than had been done previously. And in that, we were able to both ask whether or not our observed network was different than the cumulative risk model over here. We were also able to ask whether or not the clustering looked similar to the deprivation and threat hypothesized model. And we did this in 3 different samples. We did it in 2 smaller samples, about 150 and 200 kids. And we found what we would expect, essentially. So interestingly, we found 2 clusters, not one big cluster or 7 clusters. All of those were possibilities. We found that the home environment and parental education income to needs clustered with their cognitive performance, whereas their emotional performance clustered with domestic violence and community violence and abuse. We also found that physical neglect clustered with the other maltreatment variables. So we sort of never really got neglect to move into the deprivation sample. It was kind of socioeconomic status cluster still a little bit and maltreatment cluster still a little bit, but the outcomes kind of moved where we thought they would. So we tried it again, the Fragile Families data set, which had a richer set of measurements. So this is, we're taking just the data at age 3. So previously I was talking about the same sample, but with the SEM model. Here we're taking the age 3 data. We're controlling all of everything in the network for child age, gender, prenatal risk, parental socioeconomic status, parental race, parental cognitive function, so the parent's own performance on the cognitive task, and then all the other variables in the network. And we have a cluster of variables which are cognitive and social stimulation. We have a cluster of variables which are neglect, including the sort of observed neglect and the parent's report of neglect. We have a cluster of items which are abuse items, and then we have some outcomes. They're the parents' report of their psychopathology and their social behavior and their own performance in a vocabulary test. And then we have some sort of chaos, unreliable access to primary givers variable that we weren't really sure where they would go. And what we find is that these light blue items are all of our cognitive stimulation items. They are, well, first of all, we find that we get two clusters again, like we saw previously, not one big cluster. And we generally see that our cognitive stimulation items are clustering over in our sort of deprivation cluster, and they are associated with the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. And our threat cluster, all of the threat variables are clustered together, and they're clustered with psychopathology and social behavior. We also see that self-reported neglect here clusters with self-reported abuse. So this is the parent's own report of maltreatment in the family does cluster all together like we saw in the last sample. But now observed neglect, if an independent person observes neglect, that now clusters with these cognitive stimulation variables and with the Peabody Picture Vocabulary. So this was kind of the initial, the first time that we'd kind of seen confirmation of how, if you might be able to pull that neglect into the sort of hypothesized structure. And then a final thing we did was reintroduce socioeconomic status into the network to observe where it landed. And what we see here is that it is clustering with the deprivation network, but you can see it sitting right between the two clusters. And we showed that these nodes of parental education, race, and income to needs are nodes that see the most information travel through them. This is sort of a network term, which is like, that shows that they're sort of most central nodes in connecting all of the different variables together. So our network analysis did confirm there's not a single cumulative risk cluster, at least in our data, and the deprivation variables do cluster with cognitive outcomes, and threat variables cluster with emotion symptoms or symptoms of psychopathology in early childhood. And observed neglect does cluster with deprivation. So in sum, I would say the evidence to me at this point feels robust that deprivation and threat do differentially predict child development outcomes. And we've seen it both in data-driven and a priori, sort of data-driven a priori approaches and also theoretical approaches. And I want to just thank my lab and thank you guys for listening. And I'm excited to take any questions you have.
Oh, that was great. Thank you so much. All right, so this is not my strong suit, but let's see, let me see if there's a question in the Q&A from Asha Maselko. Where does the experience or feeling of not being loved by a parent by children fit into the threat versus deprivation model? It seems to conceptually slightly overlap with both, or does it fall outside this model?
Yeah, I would say it falls outside the model. I think it's an interesting question that we get a lot. And I think I wanted to really create a model of childhood adversity that was very tied to what the kid's experience was, regardless of the intent of the caregiver. And I think that as a result, I really shied away from anything in terms of self-report that felt like it was sort of filtered through the kind of years of experience that somebody might have, and across their lives, that was not just their experience with their caregiver. So, and also it's a little hard to figure out how it is that a kid learns that they're not loved. So they might learn that because of experiences of abuse, they might learn that through experience of deprivation, but they can also be in a situation in both of those situations where they don't have that experience. So even there are kids who are severely abused who really don't have the conceptualization that they're not loved. And there are kids who experience deprivation who don't have the conceptualization that they're not loved. And in both cases, it can be because in fact they are loved either by another caregiver or by the caregiver who's being incompetent as a parent. And so I really think that that idea, I think, is been so well studied in child development as this kind of like an attachment conceptualization of the relationship between the parent and the child. And I would say our stuff is just kind of like rides alongside it. It's kind of a separate way of thinking about it. I don't know if that's helpful, but.
Okay, another question from Audrey Pettifor. Great talk, Margaret. Thoughts on what we know about exposure dose and how and when these adversities happen affect onset of psychopathology, and also possible mediators interventions.
Yes. So in terms of dose, I think we're kind of, in terms of dose and timing, I think those are great questions. And we kind of baked into the hypothesis a dose idea where like bigger exposures would have a bigger effect. And we have a little bit of evidence for that. So we have evidence that in one paper showing that neglect sort of has a larger impact on the same set of executive function outcomes than the kind of cognitive stimulation variables. So we do have one example where we showed in the same study that kind of graduated impact. In terms of, and I think that is the idea, although it's hard to measure the degree of exposure. There's a lot of different dimensions along which you can measure that: the timing, the severity, the number of perpetrators. Like it's a complicated thing to really conceptualize. And so I would say we're in the beginning of that. And in terms of the timing of exposure, I think that most of the evidence is that, earlier is worse, although we're right now hoping in the STAR study, the one where we're following those adolescents up who originally had data collection in Durham, the hope is in that study we'll be able to actually look at the exposure early and also now during adolescence, because of this idea that potentially adolescence is another really moment of plasticity where the adolescent brain is really primed to receive inputs in order to shape its future development. So we are kind of hoping to be able to contrast those two things. I can see the questions. Do you want me to just answer the next one?
Oh, sure. Yes.
I was
By
like,
all means, feel free to use your reading skills.
Because it's related. So the next person is asking about, are the neurodevelopmental consequences of early adversity relatively stable across life course, or can they be influenced by subsequent exposure? And I think that's a really related question. So I would say in terms of evidence, like what it is that we know that early adversity exposure is at least in terms of violence exposure, is a huge risk factor for negative outcomes following subsequent adversity exposure. So it is definitely the case that this is kind of setting your brain up to be, I think of like, if you imagine a brain which has experienced violence early, it's primed for new experiences of violence. Then new experiences of violence like very easily lay down new learning tracks so that you overall get a brain that's even more primed for future violence. And I think we see that as psychopathology in our society, things like post-traumatic stress disorder. It could also have been very useful if you were going to live in a world where there was a lot of violence around. So in terms of psychopathology, the way that we conceptualize it in our current modern world, it is definitely a risk factor. In terms of moderators of the impact, that's related to the thing I was saying earlier, which is that I'm very interested to know, I would love to somehow study whether or not there are kind of moments later in development where interventions would be particularly useful. So maybe because the brain is, again, entering sort of a period of plasticity. So I think that is also a really interesting possibility. And I definitely think there should be moderators of outcomes. There should be a host of moderators of outcomes later, right? This is kind of like basic brain function being different, but that doesn't mean that you have psychopathology. It means your brain function is different, but we all have a bunch of different brain functions and navigate the world in slightly different ways using our individual brains. And so I definitely think there's going to be a host of important moderators of the link between adversity and psychopathology later. That was kind of a scattered answer, but I hope that was helpful. So Jess, if I could speak, Mayor asked if I could speak a little bit more about the implications of my findings for understanding how adversity gets under the skin and rethinking the role of stress processes as a mechanism linking these to future health and well-being. Yeah, I mean, I think if you think that stress is the primary mechanism, then I think you should address stress, right? So you should help people be less stressed out. And I think the place I've seen this in a way which feels most egregious to me is I really think that a lot of kids growing up in low socioeconomic status environments are not being provided with the kind of challenging learning experiences that their brains need to be able to continue to grow cognitively over the course of their childhood. And if you think that that is the problem they're having, then what you would want to provide them is some better access to scaffolded learning experiences. And that would challenge them and help them to grow and develop in that particular way. If you think that they're stressed, then what you would do is provide them with a lot of access to stress reduction. And I think sometimes I see kids growing up in kind of potentially violent circumstances with a real lack of cognitive stimulation being provided opportunities to sort of relax and calm themselves down, that I'm not wholly convinced is that they need. That is sort of instead what I'd want to see them getting is maybe a combination of emotion regulation techniques, some of which that is, but it would be really not focused on stress reduction so much as it would be focused on helping learn how to regulate your emotions. And then riding alongside that, some like real, like kind of helpful learning opportunities for them to kind of push them a little bit cognitively to develop. So sort of a different set of interventions, I would think, potentially. I know about interventions, so I think if anyone out there is thinking these interventions are perfect for those kids for exactly the reasons you're just, I definitely could be wrong. I think I'm just trying to sort of be as clear about the mechanisms as possible in the hopes that people who do intervention research and through our own work sort of trying to stimulate that field with regards to adversity exposure, that you could begin drawing those lines between the utility of ingredients in the intervention which are most useful and their the kinds of adversity that the people they're working with were likely to have experienced.
Great, thanks. Well, I'm going to take this moment to ask a question, which could turn into two. But so one question I have is how much work has been done on figuring out whether fathers can sort of potentially play the same role as mothers in this whole scaffolding building and things like that. I mean, I know the usually greater role mothers play in these infancy experiences, but I'm just curious about whether your research or other research speaks to that at all.
Yeah, I mean, we're such a metric field, aren't we? I don't have specific research that I've done that can address that, unfortunately. I wish I did. It's one of those situations where it feels as though people who study fathers have things to say about it, and then the rest of us just keep studying mom. So I think the thing I will say is that there is nothing in my conceptualization of these things that has anything to do with the identity of the caregiver. I don't think this is like a specific attachment related process that can only happen with your primary caregiver during the process of breastfeeding. Like this I think of as like really just how much are invested people who can skillfully help a child learn there to help that happen. And I think it can be your grandmother, and it can be your father, it can be a skillful, partner of any kind who's there to like help your child learn. I really don't think this is, I really think of it as situated as very differently than like strict attachment related conceptualizations of those early relationships. Not that those are wrong. I just am thinking of it a different thing, I think. Similarly, I think violence exposure, we're really thinking of violence exposure from any quarter. So instead of taking I think sometimes the conceptualization of early childhood has really centered around sort of like the importance of these early relationships as they happen in our culture, and then the violation of that important early relationship. And I'm instead really trying to take kind of a learning theory approach, not like a Skinner approach, but instead sort of the brain expecting kinds of inputs approach, and that it would seek those inputs where it could get them, and then it would also receive this kind of information about violence in a more, it would be preferentially primed to change in response to those kinds of inputs, regardless of where they came from. So instead of thinking of like that early sort of singular relationship and whether or not it's violated, it's more sort of that the caregivers that surround the child can provide these different kinds of inputs. And because early parenting often happens in the context of that attachment relationship, that may be where you see it most, but that's not, we don't have like a specific opinion about where it's coming from.
Great. Well, we are at 1 o'clock, and so I think we will wrap up. Thank you so much. This was fascinating.
Thank you.
It was just great. So
Good.
Thanks again, and applause, and we'll look forward to next time.
All right. Thank you. It was lovely meeting everybody.